My sister looked me dead in the eyes and said, "You don't even have a real life, just a house you didn't earn." 3 days later, I came home from a work trip to find her furniture in my living room and her name written on a moving box sitting on my porch. I didn't yell. I didn't cry. I walked inside, set my bag down, and called the non-emergency police line. I want to tell you how we got there, because none of this happened overnight. I grew up in Tucson, Arizona, the younger of 2 daughters in a family that looked fine from the outside. My father worked in logistics for a mid-size shipping company. My mother ran the house and did bookkeeping part-time for a friend's business. We weren't wealthy, but we weren't struggling either. We had a clean split level in a quiet neighborhood, summer road trips in a minivan, and a mother who made casseroles on Sunday nights. Normal, right? Except that my older sister, Noelle, was the son this family revolved around. 4 years older than me, louder, funnier, the one who filled every room she walked into. My parents didn't set out to play favorites, I don't think. It just happened the way gravity happens, without intention, without anyone noticing until you're already falling. Noelle graduated high school and went to the state university on a partial scholarship, which my parents supplemented without blinking. When she struggled her freshman year and needed to repeat 2 courses, they drove 4 hours to take her out to dinner and reassure her. When I graduated with a higher GPA 2 years later and got accepted to a design program at a school in Portland, my mother's first response was, "Oregon? That's so far." My father's was, "Is design even something you can make a living at?" I had been drawing since I was 7. I painted murals on my bedroom wall at 12. I spent 3 summers in high school taking every art elective the district offered and then some at a local community studio on weekends, paying for the supply fees myself from a part-time job at a copy shop. None of that seemed to register as something worth supporting. I went to Portland anyway. I took out loans and worked 25 hours a week at a print shop while carrying a full course load. I called home on Sundays and learned quickly not to mention how tired I was, because the response was always some variation of, "Well, that's the path you chose." I visited for holidays, watched Noelle's new apartment get furnished with hand-me-down pieces my parents drove 3 states to deliver, and smiled through dinners where her job as an office manager at a dental practice was described as so stable, so smart. The one person who never made me feel like a problem was my maternal grandmother, Loretta. She lived in a small house in Flagstaff, about 2 hours north of my parents', tucked into a neighborhood of old pines and wide porches. She had raised 4 kids largely on her own after my grandfather died young, and she had the particular calm of someone who had survived enough to stop worrying about appearances. Every time I visited her, she fed me and asked me about my work, and actually listened to the answer. She kept a folder on her kitchen desk of things I'd made, a logo for a local nonprofit, a flyer I'd designed for a school fundraiser, things I'd mentioned once and she'd looked up and printed. "You have an eye," she told me once while we were sitting on her porch watching the birds at her feeder. "Don't let anyone talk you out of using it." I graduated from the Portland Design Program at 23, moved into a shared apartment with a friend named I should back up. I'll call her Kit, because that's what everyone called her. Katrina on her birth certificate, Kit to everyone who actually knew her. We met in a typography seminar our sophomore year and had been friends since. She was getting her MFA in illustration and was the most genuinely kind person I'd met since leaving Arizona. We found a 2-bedroom in Northeast Portland with a landlord who didn't mind us painting an accent wall in the kitchen and moved in with a second-hand couch and enough determination to paper over the uncertainty. I got a junior position at a small brand studio 6 weeks after graduation. The pay was modest, but I was building something. 2 years in, I got promoted. 2.5 years in, the studio lost its anchor client, then its second biggest client within the same quarter, and then on a Wednesday morning I showed up to find the doors locked and a handwritten note taped to the glass, thanking us for our time. I spent the next 4 months freelancing, pitching, following up on pitches, and slowly watching my savings disappear. Kit covered more than her share of the rent while I scrambled. I kept most of it from my family because I'd been told enough times that instability was what I'd signed up for, that I couldn't stomach hearing it again. But by month 5, I was behind on my portion of the rent, had maxed 1 credit card, and was eating a lot of rice and frozen vegetables. I finally called home. My mother answered. I explained, calmly and briefly, that I was going through a rough patch and could use a short-term loan, enough to cover 1 month's rent while I stabilized. I promised to pay it back. There was a pause, and then she called my father into the room. He didn't yell. He was worse than that. He was calm. He said that this was exactly why they'd worried about the direction I'd chosen. He said that Noelle had just gotten a raise and was saving for a house, which was what practical decisions looked like. He said that helping me would be enabling a pattern that wasn't sustainable. My mother said they'd just helped Noelle with a car repair and didn't have extra funds, which I knew wasn't the whole truth, but I was too depleted to argue. The call ended. No offer of help. No, we love you, we're sorry. Just the soft click of them hanging up. I sat on the bathroom floor for a while after that. Then I texted my grandmother. She called back within 10 minutes. Tell me what you need, she said. That was it. No lecture. No, I told you so. Just tell me what you need. She couldn't send money. She was on a fixed income and I wouldn't have taken it anyway. But she told me to come to Flagstaff if it got to that point. My couch is yours, she said. You are never sleeping in your car. I thanked her and told her I'd figure it out. I really believed I would. I did barely. A former client came through with a contract 2 weeks before I would have had to call my grandmother and admit I needed the couch. Kit and I stabilized. I started rebuilding slowly, then steadily. I got better at freelancing, started picking up retainer clients, built a small portfolio of brand identities for local businesses. By the time I was 27, I had a real roster and had started thinking about formalizing things under an actual business name. And then my grandmother got sick. It was a slow accumulation. Her health had been fine and then it wasn't. A fall, then a pneumonia diagnosis, then complications that her doctor said were serious. I drove down to Flagstaff every 2 weeks through those months. I sat with her while she watched birds through the window. I helped her sort through paperwork and boxes she'd been meaning to go through for years. I didn't do it because I expected anything. I did it because she was Loretta and she had never once made me feel like a burden. She passed on a Sunday morning in April, which is still somehow the worst month in my memory. The reading of her will happened 3 weeks later. My mother was there, and Noelle, and 2 of my grandmother's siblings' adult children who had driven in from out of state. Loretta had left her house, a paid-off, 3-bedroom craftsman on a 1/4 acre in Flagstaff, to me. She'd left my mother some jewelry and a quilt she'd always admired. She'd left Noah a cedar chest and a small cash amount. The rest of the estate, modest but real, also went to me with instructions that a portion be set aside for any debts I carried. My mother went pale. Noelle left before the paperwork was finished. That night I got a text from my sister. She barely knew you anymore. This isn't right. I didn't respond. I moved to Flagstaff 6 weeks later. The house needed updating in some rooms, but it had been maintained carefully and it had Loretta's fingerprints everywhere. The particular green she'd painted the back bedroom, the deep porch where the bird feeder still hung, the garden bed she'd kept going every spring. I painted some things, left others alone. I converted the sunroom into a workspace and rebranded my freelance practice as Sycamore Creative, a name I picked because there was a sycamore at the edge of the property she'd planted 20 years earlier. The design work grew. Flagstaff has a real small business community, independent restaurants and shops and nonprofits, and I could offer them something the bigger agencies couldn't: attention, flexibility, and rates that made sense for their budgets. Within 18 months I had 3 steady retainer clients, and a 4th who came on board after I redesigned his restaurant's brand identity and his weekend reservations doubled. I hired a part-time contractor to help with production work. I bought a second-hand espresso machine and put it in the corner of the sunroom and started most mornings looking out at the sycamore while the coffee brewed. I had a real life, is what I'm telling you. Quiet and mine. I wasn't in close contact with my family. My mother and I exchanged birthday calls and the occasional text. Noelle and I had barely spoken since the will reading. My father and I talked even less. It was a distance I'd stopped trying to close because every time I did, I came away feeling smaller than before I'd reached out. Then, about 8 months ago, the text started. My mother reached out first, warmer than usual. Thinking of you. Hope work is going well. Then Noel, hey, haven't talked in forever. Miss you, sis. Then, 2 days after that, my father, Mom says you've built something real out there. We'd love to see it sometime. I read all 3 messages in sequence and sat with them for a minute. People don't usually reach out after years of silence without a reason. I texted back politely to all 3. Fine, busy, thanks. 2 weeks later, Noelle called. She'd lost her job. The dental practice had gone through ownership changes and her position had been eliminated. She was looking, she said, but the market was tough. She mentioned, almost as an aside, that she and her boyfriend had broken up and she'd had to leave the apartment they'd shared. She was staying with my parents temporarily. Temporarily was doing a lot of work in that sentence. My mother called the following week. My father had been offered early retirement with a reduced package. The company was downsizing. He'd taken it, she said, because refusing wasn't really an option. They were looking at their finances. The house was fine, she said, but things were tight. I said I was sorry to hear that. I meant it. My father called a few days after that. He asked general questions about Flagstaff, about the neighborhood, about property values. He asked, with an air of casual interest, how many bedrooms my grandmother's house had. 3, I said. Good bones on those old craftsmen's, he said. I got off the phone and called my friend Marcus from the Flagstaff design community, not the Marcus from my used name list, just someone I trusted, and told him about the conversation. He said what Kid had said when I'd filled her in earlier that week. They want something. Be careful. The visit was proposed by my mother, framed as a long overdue reconnection. I agreed to a Saturday lunch. I made it clear, just lunch, not a weekend, not an open-ended stay. I set that boundary explicitly and repeated it twice. They arrived at noon. My father walked through the front door and went immediately quiet in the focused way that means someone is assessing rather than appreciating. My mother touched everything. The kitchen counters, the window frames, the built-in shelves in the hallway, and kept saying Loretta kept this so nicely, in a way that somehow managed to erase my 2 years of work on the place. Noelle was quieter than I'd expected. She sat in the living room and looked out at the garden and didn't say much. During lunch, my father asked about the mortgage. I told him there wasn't one. He nodded like this confirmed something. My mother asked about the sunroom and whether the work-from-home arrangement was sustainable long-term. Noelle asked how many square feet the house was. After we ate, my father said he needed to use the bathroom. He was gone for a long time. When he came back, I noticed his phone in his hand and the slight adjustment in how he was carrying himself. The practiced casualness of someone who's just done something they don't want noticed. I walked them out at 3. Hugs were exchanged. My father said the drive back would be fine, only 3 hours. He said the house was beautiful, really beautiful. That night I checked the security cameras I'd installed after Kid had warned me to stop being naive about my family's intentions. My father had photographed every room. I didn't confront them. I called my grandmother's lawyer instead, the same one who'd handled the estate, and asked him to review the deed and confirm there were no outstanding claims or challenges possible. He called back the next morning. Clean title, he said, solely in your name. There is no legal avenue for anyone to contest the inheritance at this point. The window has long closed. I also changed the locks. The calls continued over the following weeks. My mother mentioned twice that Noelle was really struggling and needed a stable environment to get back on her feet. My father said, in the context of a conversation about nothing in particular, that large houses often made more sense as family homes than as single-person residences. Noelle texted to ask if I'd ever thought about taking in a roommate. Each conversation felt like a different angle of the same approach. I kept my answers short and didn't take the bait. Then I left for a work trip to Scottsdale. A branding conference, 2.5 days, clients I needed to see in person. I'd been planning it for 2 months. I was in a session on the second morning when my neighbor, a retired school teacher named Mrs. Feld, who had known my grandmother and checked in on the house when I traveled, sent me a text. Your sister's here. She's unloading a car. Thought you were out of town? I stepped out of the session into the hallway and called her back. She's been here about an hour, Mrs. Feld said. There's a truck too. A man I don't recognize is helping carry things in. I didn't want to interfere, but it didn't seem right. I opened the security app on my phone. The camera at the back of the house showed my sister propping the back door open. The camera at the front showed the truck Mrs. Feld had mentioned and 3 people carrying boxes. My father's car was parked on the street. I watched the footage for 30 seconds. My father had a flathead screwdriver. He used it to force the latch on the back door. He used a screwdriver to break into my home. I called Noelle's phone immediately. She answered on the second ring, chipper in a way that felt practiced. "Hey, we were just going to call you. Get out of my house," I said. There was a pause. "Okay, I know this looks sudden, but we figured it made more sense to get settled before you got back and then explain. You broke in." "Dad just helped with the door. It wasn't Noelle." I kept my voice even. I'd made a decision the moment I saw that footage, and I wasn't going to let them talk me out of it with emotional maneuvering or appeals to family loyalty or guilt about being cruel. "I am calling the police. You have 20 minutes to get out of my house before they arrive. If you are still there when they arrive, you will be arrested for trespassing and breaking and entering." She tried to hand the phone to my father. I heard him say in the background, "Tell her she's being dramatic." I had already hung up. I called the Flagstaff PD non-emergency line, reported a break-in in progress at my address, explained that I was the homeowner and out of town, and gave them the situation. The dispatcher was calm and thorough. She asked if I wanted officers to respond. I said yes. Then I booked the first flight home. Kit talked me through the next 3 hours on the phone while I waited at the airport. She didn't try to soften what had happened or suggest I consider their perspective or float the possibility that maybe they hadn't understood what they were doing. "They knew exactly what they were doing," she said. "You don't rent a truck by accident." She was right. They had rented a truck. This had been planned. When I got home, Mrs. Feld met me in the driveway. She'd stayed to speak with the officers. My family had refused to leave voluntarily and had required the responding officers to formally require their departure. My father had argued. One of the officers, according to Mrs. Feld, had told him quite plainly that the homeowner's relationship to the trespassers was irrelevant to the question of whether they had permission to be there, which they did not, and whether they damaged property to gain entry, which they had. They left, slowly and with commentary the whole way, but they left. I walked into my house. The living room had been rearranged. 3 of Noelle's moving boxes sat by the fireplace. A photo of my family, from years ago before any of this, had been placed on the mantel where I kept a print I'd bought from a local artist. My bedroom door was open. My closet had been partially cleared on one side. I stood there for a moment. Then I went to the kitchen, made coffee, and called my grandmother's lawyer. The security footage was provided to the police as documentation of the break-in. My father had, on camera, used a tool to force entry into a locked residential property. My lawyer filed for a temporary restraining order the following week. The judge granted it. My father and Noelle were prohibited from approaching the property. I had the locks rekeyed again and a locksmith install a deadbolt on the back door. Over the following 2 months, my father maintained that he'd done nothing wrong, that family property should be shared, that my grandmother had clearly not been thinking clearly when she'd revised her will to leave everything to me, that I was being vindictive. His lawyer sent a letter raising the possibility of a competency challenge. My lawyer responded with my grandmother's medical records going back 4 years, including 3 cognitive assessments done as part of her annual geriatric care reviews. She had been fully competent. The challenge went nowhere. Noelle didn't speak to me for the first month. Then she sent a text that I read and didn't respond to. Then, in the second month, she sent a letter, handwritten, which surprised me. It wasn't a good letter in the sense of being well-crafted or convincing. It was rambling and circled back on itself. But it was honest in a way her other communications hadn't been. She wrote that she had told herself the whole plan was reasonable because she needed it to be, and that she'd known even while helping carry boxes that she was crossing a line she couldn't uncross. She didn't ask for forgiveness. She asked if I was okay. I thought about that for a long time. My mother had not been at the house during the break-in. She'd stayed home, she told me later in a brief call, because she'd had a bad feeling about it from the start. I don't know if that's true. I know she'd made no effort to stop it. But she was the only one of the three who didn't require police intervention to leave my property, so she got a different kind of consideration from me than my father and sister did. My father faced misdemeanor charges for the property damage. He received probation and a fine. He still has not apologized. Noelle and I have exchanged a few texts in the month since. Nothing deep, nothing resolved. A kind of careful acknowledgement that the other person exists. I don't know what it becomes. I'm not deciding in advance. What I know is this. Kit flew out for a long weekend in October and we sat on the back porch in the early evening while the sycamore went gold and we drank wine and talked about the kind of things that don't require any particular resolution, just someone to share them with. I know that Mrs. Pertingvern Feld brought me soup when I came home from the airport that first night, setting it on my porch with a note that said, "You don't have to figure it out tonight." I know that Sycamore Creative turned a real profit for the first time this past spring, and that I hired my first full-time employee, a 24-year-old just out of school who reminds me a little of myself, and that watching her get better at her work week by week is one of the better parts of my days. I know that the bird feeder in the backyard is full. I refill it every Sunday, the way my grandmother did. I have learned, very slowly, the names of the birds. I know that Loretta left me this house because she wanted me to have roots, and I have them now, set down in soil that no one can take from me. I used to think the hardest thing was being the one your family decided didn't need support. I've learned it's actually something smaller and more specific than that. It's the moment you realize you've been waiting for them to change their mind. The moment you stop waiting is quieter than you'd expect. It doesn't feel like giving up. It feels like finally putting down something heavy you'd been carrying for so long, you forgot it wasn't yours. If you're watching this, and you're somewhere in the middle of that, still waiting, still hoping the people who should love you will figure out how, I want you to know the weight does get lighter. Not because they change, usually, but because you do. There's a sycamore tree at the edge of my property that my grandmother planted 20 years before she died. I didn't know its name when I moved in. I had to look it up. That feels like a small thing, but I think about it a lot. How she lived with that tree for 2 decades, learned its seasons, watched it grow, and then left it to me without explanation, trusting that I would figure out what it was and take care of it anyway. That's what the whole inheritance felt like, honestly. Not a gift handed over cleanly, but a responsibility passed down with the quiet confidence that I was the one who would actually show up for it. My sister didn't see it that way. She saw square footage and a paid-off deed and an opportunity that had been distributed unfairly. And I understand on some level why she felt that way. She'd been told her whole life that she was the one who mattered more, and then the one person who'd seen things differently left everything to me. That had to sting. I'm not pretending it didn't. But there's a difference between feeling something is unfair and deciding that entitles you to take it. My sister crossed that line the morning she helped load boxes into a rental truck headed for my address while I was 3 hours away at a work conference. That wasn't grief or frustration, or even selfishness in the ordinary sense. That was a plan, made deliberately, carried out with help, while I was gone. She knew what she was doing. She did it anyway. What I've learned from all of it? The years of being the overlooked one. The months of losing everything and rebuilding it. The morning I watched my own father force a screwdriver into my back door lock on a security camera from a hotel room. Is that the consequences we experience are almost always downstream of choices we made or choices others made toward us, others made toward us? My grandmother chose to see me clearly when no one else did. She chose to leave me something solid. I chose to stay close to her when it was inconvenient and expensive, and when my family made it plain they didn't understand why I bothered. Those choices compounded quietly over years into something real. My sister and my father made their own choices. They chose convenience over integrity. They chose to take rather than earn. And the consequences of that, the restraining order, the misdemeanor charge, the fractured relationships that may never fully repair, those didn't come from nowhere. They came from a long sequence of decisions that each of them made freely. I'm not telling you this to be self-righteous about it. I made plenty of mistakes along the way. I waited too long to trust my own read on the situation. I let the second visit happen when everything in me said not to. I gave them chances I probably shouldn't have. But I also learned, eventually, that knowing better and acting on it are two different skills, and the second one takes longer to build. What got me through was not optimism or luck. It was something quieter. The ability to keep working at something real even when no one was watching or approving. My grandmother had it. Kit had it. I had to grow into it. And on the other side of all of it, I have a business I built from nothing. A house I maintain and love. A neighbor who brought me soup when I came home to a violated space. And a friendship that proved itself when it counted. The tree is doing well this year. I've learned when it drops its leaves and when the new growth comes back and what the bark looks like in late winter. My grandmother knew all of that, and now I do too. Some things get passed down exactly the way they're supposed to.